beyond the thunder and lightning, past the clouds, over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Well, greetings and welcome back as always. Thank you all so much for joining us. And we really hope that you had a wonderful, wonderful holiday, however you chose to celebrate, commemorate, or just spend some good time with family. FAIR has a story entitled Corporate Media Parrot Dubious Drug Claims That Justify War on Venezuela. Since August, the U.S. has been amassing military assets in the Caribbean. Warships, bombers, and thousands of troops have been joined by the USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, in the largest regional deployment in decades. Why? Is the media complicit in spinning the rhetoric and beating the drums towards war? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. With each episode, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into current events and the broader historical context in which most of these events take place. Let's quickly look at a couple of today's headlines. Luigi Mangione heads back to court for his pretrial hearings in New York City. Here's what his attorneys are arguing. The 27-year-old accused of fatally gunning down United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson last December in New York appeared in court today, and his defense team is arguing certain evidence should not be allowed during trial. So the judge has scheduled a series of suppression hearings, which are expected to last several days, if not a week. His attorneys argue statements he made to law enforcement should be suppressed because they claim officers failed to provide Miranda warnings, which is when a suspect is informed of their constitutional rights. The defense also argues evidence seized at the time of his arrest at a McDonald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania, shouldn't be allowed because they claim law enforcement did a warrantless search of his backpack after he was handcuffed and surrounded by officers. Folks, it'll be very interesting to see how the court holds on these defense challenges since the late 60s. The Warren Court, the Supreme Court has moved back to the right, away from civil liberties and closer to greater latitude for the state. So it will be very interesting to see how the court holds on these defense challenges. Kristi Noem blames Biden Afghanistan abandonment for National Guard shooting. In an interview with Meet the Press yesterday, Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem criticizes the Biden administration after revelations that the suspect in the shooting of two National Guard members arrived in the U.S. under Operation Allies Welcome, a Biden-era program that resettled thousands of Afghans after Kabul fell to the Taliban in 2021. Here's a little bit of the interview from Meet the Press.
Information on this. needs to know that we will be coming after you and we will bring you to justice. We absolutely will persecute you because we do know that we will never allow this to continue to happen in our country. Allow individuals who came to our country that were unvetted by Joe Biden, allowed to run free and loose. We are going to bring them to justice and make sure that they're returned out of this country if they aren't here for the purposes of being an American.
I want to follow up with you. I mean, you say something very notable. You say he was radicalized here. This suspect, we should note, was a member of the CIA-trained strike force. According to former intelligence and military officials, he would have undergone extensive vetting during his tenure there. And afterwards, it is worth noting Citizenship and Immigration Services, an agency which is a part of DHS, approved the suspect's asylum application in April of this year. Why did the Trump administration grant the suspect asylum in April? Did you know then that he was moving toward radicalization?
Well, Kristen, you need to remember that when this abandonment of Afghanistan happened, the Biden administration put people on airplanes, brought them to the United States without vetting them. They brought them into our country and then said they would vet them afterwards. And then at that time, to do a good job of vetting people, you need to have cooperation of that government that is from their country. You have to have a stable government that will give you information, contacts, background information, and biometrics that you may need to identify that individual, their dates of service. All of that vetting information was collected by Joe Biden's administration that was used in the process. So President Trump, thankfully, has completely changed that. We are now using all social media content. We're going after what they have been doing with their contacts, their biometric data information we are collecting. Now, when we vet individuals under this administration, we know who they are, why they are here, and going through that. Unfortunately, this individual, that entire process happened under Joe Biden's watch.
Well, but just to be very clear, I want to go back to what happened on the Trump administration's watch. He was extensively vetted in order to serve alongside U.S. service members as a part of the CIA-trained strike force. But in terms of what happened on the Trump administration's watch, just to be very clear, what vetting did the Trump administration do before giving this suspect asylum?
The vetting process, Kristen, happens when the person comes into the country, and Joe Biden completely did not vet any of these individuals, did not vet this.
Folks, a couple things quickly on this. First of all, it's very important to always remember part of governing is taking responsibility. And at every turn, Donald Trump wants to blame Lottie Dottie and everybody else for the shortcomings and the mistakes and the utter idiocy that comes out of his administration. Did you notice in the very opening of the part of the clip we played, Kristi Noem said she wants everyone to know we will persecute you. She didn't say prosecute. She said persecute. Now, as I understand it, democracies prosecute while dictatorships persecute. And what she said in terms of Biden flying the people from Kristi Noem is lying to you. That's not the way this happened. Folks did not just get on planes in Kabul and fly to New York and then get left at the airport at JFK to run amok around the country. These folks went from Kabul to Qatar. They spent a couple of years in Qatar being investigated, and then they were brought into the country. She is intentionally misrepresenting the process. And I don't say this as someone who just wants to defend Joe Biden, because I'm not. I'm just telling you this because what she's telling you is a lie. Final point. Trump declares closure of Venezuela's airspace. He said on Saturday that the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela is to be closed, a sign that he might soon launch an attack on the country with the aim of ousting President Nicolas Maduro. Folks, you need to be asking your elected representatives, and you need to be calling the White House and asking the president, what is your plan? Do you have a strategy? And why in the world are you doing this? I submit to you, he's bluffing, that he wants to see if he can scare President Maduro out of Venezuela. And on his way out, he's hoping that President Maduro will will sign over the rights to Venezuelan oil to American oil companies. I believe that Donald Trump is bluffing. We will see. On today's episode, the issue before us is many foreign policy analysts believe that regime change in Venezuela is the ultimate goal, but the Trump administration instead claims it's fighting narco-terrorism, accusing Caracas of flooding the U.S. with drugs via the Cartel of the Suns and Tren de Aragua, both designated as foreign terrorist organizations. What does all of this mean? Let's talk to my guest. He's a political analyst and editor at Venezuelan Analysis. He's the author of this piece, Corporate Media Parrot Dubious Drug Claims That Justify War on Venezuela. Ricardo Vaz, my brother, welcome back.
Hi, Wilmer. It's always a pleasure, even if not under the best circumstances, but I'm happy to be here.
Hey, man. And well, let me say, I'm glad you are here because we know that Donald Trump has, at least rhetorically, has other plans. So let's go back to your piece, which people can find in Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting or at fair.org. Corporate Media Parrot Dubious Drug Claims That Justify War on Venezuela. The first header in your piece, Fabricating Tensions. How so?
So over the years, even going back to when you were running the Critical Hour, we did a lot of these discussions on how the corporate media parrots propaganda that favors regime change in Venezuela. And so now you were mentioning, and it's very, very apropos, you're mentioning how in this program you put current events in the broader historical context. And here, what comes to mind is the Iraq War, the build-up to the Iraq War, where you also had a media establishment that was more than happy to echo these either unfounded or even debunked claims that ended up building this narrative for the Bush administration to go to war. And here, the Marx quote, first it happens as a farce, first as a tragedy and then as farce. So now it's much more farcical because you have these imaginary drug cartels that the Trump administration is designating as terrorist organizations, when the evidence shows the complete opposite. So you were mentioning Tren de Aragua, and Tren de Aragua appeared in most people's consciences during the Trump campaign for re-election a couple of years ago, because nobody knew this was a very local gang here in Venezuela that then kind of embedded itself in migration, but it was never a major player in terms of international crime, let alone drug trafficking. And you don't have to take my word for it. U.S. intelligence agencies compiled a memo for the administration that said, first of all, there is no evidence of any ties between the Venezuelan government and Tren de Aragua. If anything, they are enemies, and the government has taken steps in the past to root out Tren de Aragua here in Venezuela. And secondly, all the evidence of Tren de Aragua involvement in drug trafficking happens, if anything, at street level. So they are, petty criminals at the last rungs of the chain. And then with the Cartel of the Suns, it's even more absurd because it's not even clear that this exists. So the Cartel of the Suns goes back to a creation of the CIA here in Venezuela in the 1990s, before Chavez came to power. So it was an operation involving Venezuelan military officers to traffic drugs in cooperation with the CIA. We know that that's one of their specialties. And the name Suns is because the military officers have an insignia of a sun on their uniforms. And then every now and then, whenever whatever administration was in the White House, it needed to demonize the Venezuelan government, it fabricated this idea that the Venezuelan government was flooding the U.S. with drugs, and then it found whatever useful partner existed at the time. I mean, before it was the rebels from the FARC here in Colombia, and then the rebels demobilized and they just invented somebody else. But there's never been any evidence that this cartel exists, even less so that it has anything to do with high-ranking Venezuelan officials. That's not to say that there isn't, corruption and some army officer that will take a bribe to allow a drug shipment to go through. I mean, of course, that happens, and even more so in a country that has been under economic terrorism for so long, and you have kind of a loosened control from the state. But there's nothing to point out at any kind of centralized structure that could be considered a cartel. But to your point, back to the broader war propaganda, this idea that many outlets report that there are tensions between Venezuela and the United States, and maybe in a very literal sense this is true. But how can you create both sides when one of the sides has brought an aircraft carrier and the other is just standing up for its own sovereignty? It's an absurd creation of two sides, which is very reminiscent of the Israeli genocide when the media talks about the Israel-Hamas conflict. It has nothing to do with the conflict. It's a very one-sided genocide. And here again, by creating two sides, it fuels the longer-term propaganda that, step by step is creating a case for war.
There are lies of commission and there are lies of omission. And you, in mentioning the cartel of the sun and talking about, yes, that organization existed in concert with the CIA and transmitting or transferring drugs through Venezuela on behalf of the CIA. So I just heard today some so-called experts from Georgetown talking about this, and they were talking about the cartel of the sun, and it does exist. They didn't talk about it in the context of the CIA. They talked about it in the context of this is the organization that President Maduro has created and that Donald Trump is correct. So you can lie by what you tell me, and you can also lie by what you don't tell me.
Yes, and I mean, it's all a fantasy, and what's amazing here in this case is that you can even get the information from the proverbial horse's mouth. So in this case, just go to the Drug Enforcement Agency. The Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, publishes a report every year. And if you go to the 2024 report, you search for the word Venezuela, and it does not appear. It does not appear at all. And 2025, it does appear with the reference of what I was mentioning on Tren de Aragua distributes drugs on the street level. So even U.S. agencies are unable to fabricate any substance into these arguments. So it's just a narrative that lives on in the officials' claims, and of course in this surrounding, you're mentioning Georgetown, this surrounding intelligentsia that is always happy to make the case for empire. But I didn't get into this in the piece because I can only analyze what the media says, but even the media does some sort of damage control for the Trump administration, because if you listen, every time he's asked about Venezuela, he says, they've been very bad to us, and it's not just the drugs. They emptied their prisons. They sent their entire prison population. And some weeks ago, he was also mentioning mental institutions, but then I think he left that out. And nobody stops to ask him, how exactly did Maduro took time from running this imaginary cartel, and he organized the entire prison population, somehow got them to Mexico, and then, I don't know, he catapulted them over the border. Did he have some special release green card program with the Biden administration? It's the kind of thing that should allow any kind of minimally serious journalist to immediately call out the Trump administration's argument, but instead they do this damage control, and ultimately they are aligned with the foreign policy interests. They are part of the same corporate plutocracy.
So what has happened to the salvaging or saving democracy argument? Because for a very long time, we've been told that Maduro's got to go because he's a strong man. He's a dictator. He lost the last election, and we have to save democracy in Venezuela. Very similar to the argument that we were hearing in Ukraine, that we have to save democracy in Ukraine, even though the United States overthrew the democratically elected, I think, Yanukovych government in Venezuela. So last I checked, President Maduro is the democratically elected president of Venezuela. I don't care what the data tells me is he won. But the point being, we're not really hearing much about democracy anymore.
I think it's a matter of, Marco Rubio was one of the people who pushed this line during the first Trump administration, even though he was a bit of a minor actor. But I think what they realized is that they would be more successful by making the case in terms of drug trafficking and homeland security. I mean, you can just pick whatever faulty argument you want, and what they did was, what's going to give us the best chance of drawing Trump's attention to this matter, because it wasn't necessarily on his radar when he took office. Of course, you can try to psychoanalyze Trump at your own peril, but in the beginning, he did seem like, he didn't want to spend too much time on Venezuela, so he sent his special envoy here. They agreed to start these deportation flights, and that was more or less it. I mean, Chevron was allowed to continue its operations to keep the oil prices down. And then there were a bit of some hiccups with the extremists in Florida who kind of held the administration hostage to approve, the big, beautiful bill and other stuff. But then slowly, both Stephen Miller, who is the White House chief of staff, and Marco Rubio started to build this case of quote unquote, and I don't know how many air quotes you can throw around this, narco-terrorism as a way to draw Trump's attention and try and convince him that this was a problem that needed solving. Again, under this very absurd U.S. exceptionalist premise that it's up to the U.S. to decide who rules here and there. There have been reports, including in the New York Times, that in private, Trump talks about Venezuela's massive oil reserves, something that you were mentioning a few minutes ago. But he's not making the case publicly, but deep down, we can, honoring the title of the show, we can connect the dots. I mean, that has to be the ultimate goal. And if the U.S. is preparing for some kind of ultimate showdown with China, it has to secure cheap natural resources, and Venezuelan oil is extremely favorable. It's extremely close and abundant. So it's obviously within the Trump regime's calculations, even if it's not going to admit so publicly.
What's the sense right now on the ground? I said at the top that honestly, I think, and I have to, this of course is a caveat, that as we sit here right now on Monday, December 1st at 3:24 p.m. Eastern time, this could change by 3:25 p.m. Eastern time, but as we sit here right now, I think Trump is bluffing. I don't think that I think he's bluffing. I think he's trying to see if he can scare President Maduro out of office, and if he can scare President Maduro into signing over the rights to Venezuelan oil. What's the sense? Is there a sense on the ground, and if so, what is that sense?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to get back to you on this, and it's good that you brought it up. That's kind of the overall conclusion everyone is arriving, because if you look at it, we have been at this for more than 3 months. The deployment, the military deployment began in August, and every now and then, it's usually right before the weekend. I don't know why they want to ruin our weekends. You get some announcement that has the propaganda saying, this is the weekend, this is going to happen, and this is the end of the Maduro government. And then, Monday comes and we start over. And the last one, was this thing you mentioned at the top, Trump writing on social media that Venezuelan airspace should be considered closed. And he lists, this is a note to airlines, pilots, drug traffickers, human traffickers, and, I don't remember who else. So, of course, at first you don't focus on the absurd, but first of all, who is trafficking drugs via airplane? Secondly, which human traffickers are following Trump on social media? But then, obviously, this generates noise and generates anxiety, and people like me go in and start looking at these flight radar monitors that can show what's happening in real time. But it looks like the airlines are not following Trump on social media, or not taking him too seriously, because the domestic flights have continued. Nothing has been suspended. And some international flights are also going on. On a more serious note, beyond Trump's announcements on social media, a few days before, the U.S. Federal Aviation Authority, I think, issued a note to airmen, NOTAM, warning that it's I'm paraphrasing, that it's dangerous to fly in Venezuela's flight information region, and that airlines should be extremely cautious. And of course, airlines are probably the most risk-averse businesses you can find. Having any kind of issue would be disastrous. And so several of the international airlines that service Venezuela have suspended, temporarily at least, their flights. So we're talking about airlines from Portugal, Spain, Turkey, Chile, and Colombia. So that has had an impact, not so much Trump's announcement. But you do get the sense that this is a kind of high stakes and deadly. It's still deadly. We're talking about the prospects of a military operation, but these military operations have been going on, and they have killed more than 80 civilians in these small vessels, either in the Caribbean or in the Eastern Pacific. But I think you are absolutely correct in that Trump is either trying to scare Maduro into resigning, or I think this would be the ideal scenario for the US, trying to trigger a military coup. So trying to raise the military threat so much that the high-ranking officers and the generals would feel that they have to depose Maduro and avert a direct attack. I think this stems from a very faulty and historically faulty intelligence and analysis of Venezuela. Because, we saw this in 2019 when John Bolton was tweeting at Venezuela's defense minister, do the right thing, and expecting him to just, overthrow the government for the sake of US interests. So up until now, the sense is that there's a lot of unity, there's a lot of cohesion in the Venezuelan armed forces. So it's not going to happen. And of course, Venezuelan leaders are very apprehensive because they are staring at all this firepower, but they are in a way calling out the administration's bluff.
There's a related story in Politico, and there are a number of variations on the theme. Lawmakers warn Hegseth may have committed war crimes following second strike report. Lawmakers from both parties raised alarms yesterday that Hegseth may have committed a war crime following a report that he ordered a follow-on attack to kill survivors of a boat strike. And this was initially reported last week by the Washington Post. How is that being reported in Venezuela?
Yeah, so here for the first time, I think so you're mentioning this was the strike on September 2. That was the first strike on these small boats on the high seas. And for a long time, I think Venezuela wanted to avoid any kind of rhetorical confrontation with the US. So it didn't really say much about the attacks and the victims. But yesterday, for the first time, the National Assembly came out and said it was going to set up a commission to investigate these attacks, investigate the Venezuelan victims and provide support for relatives. And this is a direct response to this report that you're mentioning and the subsequent reaction from the Democrats and the Republican lawmakers. So it could get a lot of attention because it's a direct order from Hegseth to leave no survivors. And the Intercept was actually the first one to report that this first strike, the boat was hit, and then they figured out that there were survivors, and they came back and killed the survivor, which is, I mean, absolutely horrific. And this kind of behavior may have been what led Admiral Halsey to resign from his post at the Southern Command. I mean, of course, there are rumors, we're speculating, but it wouldn't be out of the imagination to imagine something like this. And so the other factor when we're talking about, I mean, we talk about Venezuela proverbially calling out Trump's bluff with, its own military mobilization, not succumbing to threats, trying as best as possible to remain calm. But the other factor is, how is this playing out domestically? I think about a week or 10 days ago, there was a poll that was published by CBS that showed that 70% of the US public would oppose any kind of military intervention against Venezuela. And this includes Trump's own base. Although sometimes we feel that the MAGA crowd would be the most opposed to any kind of foreign adventure, although this poll actually showed the opposite, that the non-MAGA Republicans were more opposed than the MAGA Republicans. But as this operation goes on, and we're now into the fourth month, it has come with some kind of domestic blowback, even though the two attempts that the Democrats had to pass a war powers resolution in the Senate, they were voted down because the Republicans more or less held their line. Mm-hmm. If these issues like a potential war crime committed by the Secretary of War, if this become more high profile, then the domestic cost of continuing this operation is going to get bigger. And if that domestic cost gets bigger, then imagine what happens to an even further escalation. So I think that's also factoring into whatever the Trump administration is calculating.
I want to try to connect a couple of other dots here, because again, the Washington Post reported last week that on the first strike, there were 2 survivors. Hegseth said, kill them all. So they sent another missile in, killed those 2. Then I remember the story that maybe 4 or 5 boats later, there were 2 survivors. Those survivors actually made it ashore. Then the story early in the day was that they were going to send them to the United States. But then that quickly turned around to, we're going to repatriate them to the countries from which they've come. So I'm wondering now, with this Hegseth story surfacing, are we going to start hearing anything else from these other 2 survivors? And let me add 2 more dots and let you go from there. You mentioned Halsey, Admiral Halsey resigning, because I know he saw this coming and he knew they would blame him. So that's why I think he resigned. And final point, the video of the 7 Democrats telling members of the military, don't follow illegal orders. And the administration wanted to make a big deal about this. Oh, this is treason and they should be shot. Well, I think this video is tied to the conversation we're having right now. Your thoughts, sir? Am I drunk or?
No, actually, those are very, very useful dots to connect. So let's start with Halsey again. So you are completely right. It was very surprising when we heard the reports that one of these strikes had 2 survivors, and actually that the U.S. Navy rescued them. Mm-hmm. So again, here I'm putting on my conspiracy theorist hat. I think this might have been Halsey's coup de grace. So his final little shot against the administration in ordering that these 2 survivors be rescued, because merely in this 24 hours between the first reports and then the news that they had been repatriated to Colombia and Ecuador respectively, there were lots of reports asking the obvious questions, which is what happens to them? How are they going to be prosecuted? Because this argument that the Justice Department created, that the United States is in some kind of international conflict, it doesn't really hold water. So how do you try them? Do you try them as prisoners of war? Do you send them to Guantanamo? Because again, if you're going to go to court, it's going to expose a lot of these U.S. military operations, which are being done completely in the dark. I mean, we barely know anything about the strikes, only that we did them, we killed this many people, and it happened in the Caribbean or in the Eastern Pacific, which are very vague descriptions. So I think Halsey kind of threw in this last shot to kind of expose the contradictions of declaring some kind of international non-armed conflict, but then not wanting to prosecute eventual prisoners of war. So it kind of laid bare the contradictions there. And on the other hand, Hegseth now is much more under the spotlight after these quote-unquote seditious comments from the Democrats, because this is something that could get them in trouble, and it makes even more sense that Halsey wanted no part of it.
And again, the video, seven Democrats and I think one independent from various aspects of government saying you're not to follow illegal orders, and getting back to the media on this, the way they tried to spin it was, they all said don't follow orders, and that any order that comes from Hegseth is a legal order. Well, that's just not true.
It's not how it works.
That's just not true. Another element, a very well-researched element of your piece and again, it's in your piece is in fairness and accuracy in reporting. Corporate media parrot dubious drug claims that justify war on Venezuela, hiding the evidence. Talk a little bit about that, because one of the things that they will reference every now and then is Donald Trump has made the claim that the boats are trafficking drugs, but there is no evidence. But nobody really seems to want to delve into that, because that, to me, is an incredibly important element of an accusation. You need some evidence, Ricardo.
Yes, and also, I mean, it's not just an isolated episode. I mean, by our tracking, there have been 22 boats struck since early September, and you see a pattern, right? I mean, you see a pattern of extrajudicial executions against what are, even if they are carrying drugs, they are civilians. There's no death penalty. There's no authority to kill them in international waters, and so it's kind of a deliberate decision to not connect the dots and realize that this is a pattern of extrajudicial executions that has been identified by United Nations humanitarian experts, by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and even by other NGOs and think tanks, even inside the US. So that's on one hand, this small sentence, there's no evidence. I mean, at some point you have to start questioning a little bit more, even because there was actually another story a few weeks ago that the US Coast Guard actually seized the largest cocaine shipment ever. And so you wonder, is it possible to seize drugs without killing the people involved? So there are really a lot of incongruences in this US strategy that the media is not willing to ask. So that on one hand, but on the other, when it comes to the broader narrative, the Trump administration gets an even larger pass, because it just gets to say, the Trump administration accuses Maduro of high-profile drug trafficking, and then in the best-case scenario, we hear or we read Maduro denies the accusations, and then it's up to the reader. Who are you going to trust? Even Trump, for all the bad rap that he has, is not as demonized as Maduro. I think I'm not sure if this made it to the final version of the piece, but you read that Maduro is an authoritarian, and yet these very same outlets will call Trump an authoritarian in other coverage. So, why in this particular one, it's just Trump against the authoritarian Maduro? Why not recall that Trump has also been accused of authoritarian practices, both at home and abroad? So it goes to show, sometimes it's just these blatant fabrications, but in others, it's just this subtle or not so subtle bias that kind of tilts the playing field into, demonizing Venezuela, framing these accusations as if it's an he said, she said type of argument when, I was mentioning the DEA, but there are other sources here. The United Nations every year publishes a report on global drug flows, and it finds every year that Venezuela is a marginal player, and that's just for geographical reasons. If you think about, the biggest producers are, first and foremost Colombia, and then also to a smaller extent Peru and Bolivia, and the biggest demand is in the US. You look at the map, you ignore the borders, and you think, what's the most effective way to get drugs from point A to point B? It is through the Pacific and Central America, and that's exactly what happens. For all the demonization that you can put around drug trafficking, it's still at the end of the day a business, and so it works like any other kind of corporate multinational business where actors want to minimize costs and maximize profits. And that's why and for other reasons, of course, when the action of the Venezuelan government and so on, Venezuela is not a relevant actor in terms of getting drugs to the US. And even if it was, it's not going to get there through these small boats that have to refuel 20 times just to get to Florida.
Well, in fact, to your point about their businessmen, you and I had a conversation after the first boat was struck when they said there were 11 people on the boat. And I said to you, well, that doesn't make any sense because you don't need 11 people on the boat. And if you just averaged 180 pounds per person, that's 1,800 pounds of people. And if you're a businessman, you'd be wanting 1,800 pounds of narcotics, not 1,800 pounds of people. It just doesn't pass the giggle test.
Or the small test.
Well, none of the tests. Now,
yes.
In terms of evidence, I remember after maybe the fourth boat was struck, they showed this picture. Oh, we have evidence. And they showed this pallet of wrapped packages. And those things were as clean and you tell me you struck a boat with a missile in the ocean and you're going to it just didn't make sense, Ricardo.
Maybe now you have missile-resistant, water-resistant drug packaging.
Thank you. You solved the mystery, as you always do.
It's a more logical explanation than the alternative. But going back to your point, this has been brought up regularly. Why were there 11 people on the boat? Mm-hmm. It doesn't make any sense unless you start to think about the alternatives. First of all, this boat was not headed to the US. Actually, Rubio said it and then kind of changed the subject. He said this boat was headed to Trinidad, and Trinidad is to the east, mm-hmm. and it's very close to Venezuela, and it's a route that historically has been used for smuggling. And again, smuggling is a business, whether you're smuggling subsidized fuel or narcotics or whatever, or if you're smuggling people, which is a very strong possibility in this case. That's why perhaps there were so many people on the boat. But again, the kind of the level of extrajudicial reach to kill them in international waters and then come up with these absurd drug trafficking stories. It's something that a mildly serious media establishment would not allow to fly, but we know what we're dealing with.
I want to switch gears, but it is still related. Journalists say they know why Trump pardoned Honduran drug trafficker. Now, we have been told by the president that this is a war on drugs, but he now plans to pardon Juan Orlando Hernandez, former president of Honduras and convicted drug trafficker who, if I've got this right, is he serving time here in the United States?
If I understand correctly, he is. who is in prison in the US. But again, it just goes to show how the narrative just falls apart so easily. And here you have on one hand creating an imaginary cartel in Venezuela, and then on the other, here you have someone that was, it wasn't easy to prosecute him. Remember that Juan Orlando Hernandez was a very useful U.S. ally in Honduras, to the point where the U.S. helped him win re-election with one of the most blatant acts of fraud that exist in recent memory. This was in, I think, 2017. I might be mistaken, but there was a vote count that had the other candidate in the lead, and then it was paralyzed. And then when the power came back, Hernandez was winning. It was just the most blatant election theft, done with full U.S. complicity both before and after the election, because again, this was a very useful player for U.S. interests, whether it's cracking down on migration, allowing U.S. military assets to fly through Honduras, or, as we later found out, drug trafficking. So to the point where you had such a high evidence threshold that would allow a useful U.S. ally to be prosecuted and sentenced in U.S. courts, and then Trump comes and says, "Oh, a lot of people in Honduras told me to pardon him, that he had nothing to do, and that's it." It's just, not that we were thinking that the Trump administration was serious about anything, but it just gets exposed as everything being so superficial and flimsy all the time.
Now, this article is published in Raw Story. Journalists say they know why Trump pardoned Honduran drug trafficker. And further into the story, they say there's a 90% chance Trump wants to pardon Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who was convicted, because he's connected to people like Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen and the rest of the tech bro morons, wrote Chronicles magazine correspondent Gonzalez in a recent social post on X. Do you have any insight into any connections between Juan Orlando Hernandez and Peter Thiel and Andreessen?
I haven't seen anything concrete. This is a bit, geographically away from my area of expertise. Mm-hmm. But if you want to connect the dots and see where they lead, drug trafficking always ends in the U.S. financial system. This money has to be laundered somewhere, and we know where it is. And we have, it's not just we're speculating. We know there were scandals like the Wachovia Bank in 2007, where they were laundering hundreds of millions in travelers' checks every day, and that never alerted any regulator. So here in this case, what happened in Honduras, and I was mentioning how Hernandez was a useful ally. It was kind of a playground for some of the most advanced neoliberal experiments, and some of them they call them special economic zones. So these are kind of geographical areas where basically it's the law of the neoliberal jungle, no taxes, no labor regulations, what have you. And so it drew people like these, quote, tech bro morons. And so it's not out of the question that, if you want to connect the dots and fill the circle, that these mechanisms and these corporations that were there were also part of the overall scheme to, sell drugs on one hand and launder money on the other.
There have been some stories about Russia's response and statements of support and providing military assistance to President Maduro and to Venezuela. One of the things that I had been saying, and people were also asking about China, and I was saying that I don't know that China. Well, I don't know that either China or Russia would directly get involved. That I think China's leverage would come from the financial side of things, based upon the amount of U.S. Assets that China holds. Mm-hmm. And but so where do you see, if Donald Trump were insane enough to take military action, do you have any any idea on what other responses there might be?
Yeah, so we covered, let's say, the Venezuela front, the U.S. domestic front, and maybe this would be the third, like, the international front. And again, any kind of military action would lead the U.S. to incur in a very significant diplomatic cost. Whether Trump cares about it or not, it depends on what's the larger fallout. So when we talk about Russia and China, I think sometimes people get a bit carried away with wishful thinking. And of course, these are important allies in many senses for Venezuela, and Venezuela is an important ally to China and Russia. But when we talk about support for a conflict, you have to think about the supply lines, and Venezuela is very far away from both Russia and China. So you could think about some kind of longer term support, but it's not easy from a logistical standpoint. We saw in recent weeks there were two military cargo planes from Russia that arrived. I imagine those brought spare parts, munitions, and perhaps also military technicians to assist with the equipment, which by now is mostly Russian. So Venezuela historically had this huge dependence on the U.S., which extended to the armed force, and then Chavez understood that this might be dangerous for our sovereignty, and there was a gradual process in terms of switching to different arms suppliers, mostly Russia, but also to some extent China, and to a different extent Iran. So all these allies, perhaps Iran would be the most willing to step up, but it's also very, very far away. But there are other channels, as you were mentioning, which might not provide such an immediate response. I mean, one of them is diplomacy, and of course international condemnation, and exposing the U.S. even further as this kind of rogue state that just spreads death everywhere. That would play on the international sphere, but most importantly, regionally. I mean, already there is a very significant feeling that goes from either uneasiness to outright opposition to this military deployment. Even very friendly presidents like Mulino of Panama have said, we're not going to allow our territory to be used for any kind of operation against Venezuela. So that it would further isolate the U.S. in this hemisphere, at least from a diplomatic standpoint. Of course, how the Trump administration weighs all these factors is a different question. But in terms of a direct military confrontation, we have to be realistic that any kind of Russian or Chinese assistance would be limited.
And final question for you: there's to me a more kind of, I guess, a practical question, and that would be: does anybody in the United States military really think that right now that the United States has the ability to attack Venezuela? We're getting our hind parts crushed in Ukraine, got stomped over those 12 days messing around with Iran. We know that the United States has its eyes on the Nagorno-Karabakh region in Azerbaijan. It just doesn't, just from a sheer military math and just practical reality, sending missiles into Venezuela, many say we don't even have the missiles, just doesn't make sense. Ricardo.
Yeah, I think it goes back to your point that the Trump administration is bluffing. But I think there's a general consensus. Of course, madness is never to be discarded. But there's general consensus that there's not going to be a land invasion. You were mentioning these examples, but also another one that you brought from a different angle is Afghanistan. Afghanistan, yes. The U.S. had to rush out of Kabul, in pictures reminiscent of the rushed exit from Vietnam, yes. 50 years ago. So I don't think anyone in their right mind can believe that U.S. troops are going to storm into Venezuelan shores and remove the government and install a puppet government. I mean, that's just the sheer level of assets and manpower is completely out of reach. Now, what might be a bit more feasible and also allowing Trump to maintain his kind of mobster macho image is to use this kind of overwhelming superiority in terms of firepower and strike some kind of symbolic target. So maybe strike a dock on the coast and say, oh, we destroyed the dock where the drug boats were coming out. Or find some remote airstrip and say, oh, we destroyed the airstrip where the drugs were coming in. Maybe that is because, if the Trump administration ultimately does not want to go all the way, and all the signs point to the fact that it doesn't, it needs an exit strategy. So it needs something that it might present as a victory. And after concentrating this amount of firepower, the largest aircraft carrier in the world, there's also an idea that it has to do something, or it has to be seen to do something.
Ricardo Vaz, my man. Hey, thank you so much for your time today. Greatly appreciate that analysis. And we know, as I said, I think I said this at 3:34. It could change at 3:35. So we'll see where we are tomorrow. I may be calling you tomorrow. But final point. For a guy that, if you listen to mainstream American media, for a guy whose country is about to be invaded by the United States, you're a pretty relaxed guy. Yeah.
I follow the lead from the Venezuelan people, and they seem to be relaxed, and Maduro also seems to be fairly relaxed. Of course, I'm worried, and I'm paying attention all the time, but we have to make an effort to see things from the broader perspective. And we talked about this maybe 3 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And if you kind of dilute all the noise, we are more or less at the same place, with the imminent threats and so on. So we have to be very vigilant. We have to be very worried. But at the same time, what has changed in reality, and that's where we need to start.
Ricardo Vaz, stay safe, my brother. In all seriousness, stay safe. Greatly appreciate your time today. We will keep you in our prayers, and we look forward to having you back.
Thanks, Wilmer. It's always a pleasure, and I'm glad Venezuela is always in your focus and in your sights, and I look forward to coming back whenever you need.
And it's in my travel plans. So my brother. Thank you, man. All right, folks. I got to thank my guest, Ricardo Vaz, phenomenal journalist. Go to FAIR and read his piece. It's a phenomenal piece. Corporate media parrot dubious drug claims that justify war on Venezuela. It is a very serious and accurate indictment of how you should be an incredibly discerning reader and how you should be an incredibly discerning listener to the information that you're being presented. Because as I said in discussions with Ricardo, there are lies of omission and lies of commission. And a lot of this has to do with context. So in many instances, it's not the lie they're telling you, it's the information or the context they're omitting around the information that they do provide. Thank you all so much for listening to today, the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. A new episode tomorrow. Dr. Linwood Tawhid is going to join us tomorrow. What is really behind the economic numbers that are being reported right now? For example, with the president doing away with the reporting from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, can you even get accurate numbers to base decisions on? We're going to talk with Dr. Tawhid about that tomorrow. Please follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show, follow us on social media. All the links are below in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a blessed remainder of your day. And thank you all again so much for joining me today. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.